My name is David Maddox. I am 54 years old. On October 14th, 2025, I was standing in the foyer of Grace Community Chapel in suburban Columbus, Ohio, adjusting the knot of my silk tie in the mirror of the coat closet. It was a Tuesday morning, a day usually reserved for staff meetings and grueling budget reviews, but the air in the building felt unnaturally heavy, like the static electricity that hums before a Midwestern supercell breaks over the plains. I remember looking at my reflection and noticing how gray my skin looked against the crisp white of my starch-stiffened collar. I wasn't ill. At least, I didn't think I was. I was just tired. It was the kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't touch, the kind that comes from 30 years of trying to keep a religious institution afloat while the world outside felt like it was catching fire. I felt more like a CEO than a shepherd, and that morning, the board was expecting growth numbers I knew we couldn't hit. I stepped into the sanctuary to check the stage lighting for the evening's youth rally. The room was massive, silent, and smelled of lemon floor wax and the faint, stale scent of expensive coffee. As I reached the third row of pews, a sharp, cold sensation bloomed directly behind my breastbone. It wasn't a crushing weight yet. It felt like someone had driven a long, silver needle into the center of my heart. I stopped mid-stride, gripping the back of a wooden pew. The grain of the oak felt incredibly sharp and jagged against my palm, a physical grounding I desperately tried to hold on to as my vision began to narrow. I tried to take a deep breath, but my lungs felt like they were filled with wet, heavy cement. Then came the elephant. That's what the ER doctors call a massive myocardial infarction, and now I understand why. It felt as if 1,000 pounds of invisible weight dropped onto my chest, snapping my posture and forcing me to my knees. I collapsed onto the industrial carpet. My glasses slid across the aisle. I remember the sound they made, a tiny, plastic clink against a metal floor vent, and thinking it was the loneliest, most final sound I'd ever heard. I tried to reach for my phone, but my left arm was a dead weight, tingling with 1,000 electric stings. I lay there, my cheek pressed against the carpet, staring at a discarded gum wrapper stuck under the seat of row 4. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't even pray. I just watched a single dust mote dance in a shaft of morning light. And then the sanctuary floor began to tilt until the floor was the wall and the ceiling was a dark, screaming void. The transition wasn't a tunnel or a sudden flash of light. It was the sharp, irritating sound of a plastic bag being crinkled right next to my ear. I was in the back of an ambulance. I know this because I could see the flickering fluorescent light of the ceiling, and I could feel the violent, nauseating swaying of the vehicle as it took a hard, screeching turn on a high street. The siren was a muffled, rhythmic pulse that felt like it was beating inside my skull rather than outside the van. VFib, charged to 200, a voice barked. It belonged to a young woman, maybe 25, her face tightened with a focused, clinical aggression. I felt a massive, jarring heave in my chest, the defibrillator, but strangely, I didn't feel it in my body. I felt it as an outside observer. I was hovering somewhere near the vinyl ceiling of the rig, looking down at the physical remains of David Miller. He looked small and incredibly fragile. His expensive dress shirt had been sheared open with trauma shears, the white fabric fluttering on the floor like the wings of a wounded bird. His chest was pale, slick with conductive gel and the sweat of a dying man. No conversion. Push one of AP. Go again, 300. I watched the paramedics' gloved hands rhythmically compressing my sternum. I could actually hear the ribs cracking, a wet, snapping sound like dry kindling breaking under a heavy boot. It should have been horrifying, but I felt a strange, detached empathy for the man on the gurney. I saw the monitor, a flat, bright green line that refused to dance, no matter how much electricity they pumped into me. I looked out the tinted back window of the ambulance as we sped past a Starbucks. I saw a man in a charcoal business suit checking his watch, looking visibly annoyed that the ambulance was slowing down his morning commute. He had no idea that 10 feet away, a human life was ending in a mess of adrenaline and scorched skin. The medic stopped her compressions for a second to check the rhythm. She looked at her partner, a sweat-streaked man who was bagging my lungs, forcing oxygen into a plastic mask. She shook her head, a look of grim resignation passing over her features. Time of pulse loss was 9:14. We've been at it for 20 minutes, Greg. He's gone. The rhythm of the siren seemed to fade into a low hum that resonated in my very atoms. The ambulance, the smells of latex and burnt electricity, and the cold Ohio morning simply dissolved into nothingness. I wasn't in the clouds or a meadow of wildflowers. I was in a space that felt more solid, more real than the earth I had just left. It was a long hallway, but it had no physical walls or ceiling. It was defined by a sense of absolute, terrifying clarity, as if a layer of film had been peeled off my eyes for the first time in 54 years. I turned around, and he was standing there. He wasn't glowing with a blinding, celestial light that obscured his features. He was just there. He wore a simple, dark tunic made of rough fabric, and his skin was the color of turned earth, weathered and lined by a lifetime of sun and wind. He looked like a man who had worked with his hands in the dirt and the wood. It was Jesus. I knew it the way you know the sun is hot or the ocean is deep. It wasn't a religious belief anymore. It was a fundamental, undeniable reality of the universe. I tried to fall to my knees, to perform the pastor act I had perfected for 3 decades, the bowed head, the folded hands, the practiced tone of reverence, but I found I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't bend because there was no performance allowed in this place. There was no ministry here. There was only the truth. "David," he said. His voice didn't boom like thunder. It had the texture of gravel and wild honey. It was the most honest sound I had ever heard, and it stripped away every sermon I had ever preached, every polished anecdote I'd used to move a crowd, and every Christian platitude I'd used to shield myself from my own shadows. He didn't look happy to see me. He didn't look angry, either. He looked burdened, like a father watching his children dismantle their own family home to use the wood for a temporary bonfire. He stepped closer, and I saw the scars on his wrists. They weren't clean, symbolic marks. They were jagged, ugly, and puckered, reminders of a physical cost I realized I had spent my entire career trying to sanitize for my congregation. "You built a kingdom, David," he said, looking right through the layers of my soul. "But you used my name to lease the land." He gestured into the vastness behind him, and suddenly, the hallway opened up into a panoramic view. I wasn't seeing heaven. I was seeing the church, not just my building on High Street, but the collective heart of the people I had claimed to lead. And for the first time, I saw the rot I had been covering with expensive paint and professional branding. "We have to talk about the mistakes, David. The 5 things that have turned my house into a tomb." The space around us shifted with a sickening fluidity. We were standing in the back of a sanctuary that looked hauntingly like my own, but magnified to a distorted, gargantuan scale. I saw thousands of people, their faces not turned toward the heavens, but illuminated by the eerie, blue glow of smartphone screens held aloft to record the moment. The music was loud. A professional-grade wall of sound that vibrated in my non-physical chest, designed by engineers to bypass the mind and strike the central nervous system. On the stage, a version of myself was pacing, sweat glistening under expensive LED movers that bathed the room in artificial purples and golds. "The first mistake," Jesus said, his voice cutting through the amplified bass without rising in volume, "is the performance of presence." He pointed to the stage with a hand that looked like it had spent years pulling nets from the sea. I watched the pastor version of myself close his eyes and raise a heavy hand, whispering into a wireless headset about feeling the Spirit move in this place. But from this vantage point, I could see the machinery behind the curtain. The Spirit was a carefully timed bridge in the song, a specific low-end frequency of the bass guitar designed to trigger a physical chill in the spine. We had turned the Holy Ghost into a series of cues on a lighting console. "You've confused emotional manipulation with spiritual encounter," he continued, and the weight of his words felt like lead. I looked at the congregation. They weren't praying. They were consuming an experience. They were waiting for a hit of spiritual dopamine, a momentary escape from their broken lives, packaged as a holy moment but sold at the cost of their discernment. I saw a woman in the 3rd row crying, but her eyes were darting to the camera crane swinging past her, wondering if she'd be in the 4K highlight reel for the midweek promo. We had created a loop of vanity. "You've built stages instead of altars, David. You've taught them to worship the feeling of me rather than me. When the music stops and the lights dim, they are left with nothing but a hollow echo because you never taught them how to find me in the silence of their own wreckage." I felt a wave of shame so cold it felt like the Ohio winter. I thought of the countless hours I spent in production meetings, arguing over haze machine density and seamless transitions, while I spent mere minutes in actual, quiet prayer. We had become technicians of the sacred, engineers of an atmosphere that had plenty of smoke but no oxygen for the soul. The scene dissolved as if washed away by a gray tide, and then reformed instantly. We were in a small, cramped office. It was my office. The smells of expensive leather and old paper were unmistakable, but the walls were now lined with towering metal filing cabinets that shouldn't have been there. They were labeled with the names of every family in my congregation. Jesus walked over to one, the sound of his sandals on the hardwood floor echoing like a heartbeat, and he pulled out a drawer. Inside weren't prayer requests, baptismal records, or notes from counseling sessions. They were cold, hard spreadsheets. "The second mistake," he said, and his eyes seemed to darken with a profound, ancient sorrow, "is the conversion of souls into statistics." He reached in and pulled out a file for the Miller family, no relation to me, who had quietly stopped attending 6 months ago. In my world, they had become a churn statistic. In the church growth software we paid thousands for annually, they were simply a red cell in a column marked inactive. I remembered the meeting where we decided not to call them because their giving potential didn't justify the staff hours required to check on them. "You measured the health of my body by the size of your wallet and the count of your seats," he said, his voice flat and devastating. I watched a memory of myself sitting with the elders, looking at a graph of giving units. We weren't talking about the Millers' impending divorce or their teenage son's spiraling addiction. We were talking about the $400 a week that had vanished from the general fund. We were treating the bride of Christ like a franchise of a fast food chain, worried more about the average ticket price than the hunger of the people. "When people become numbers, they cease to be neighbors," Jesus said. He looked at me, and his eyes were like deep, dark wells of grief that I couldn't look away from. "You've created a system that rewards the high-value sheep and ignores the ones bleeding out in the thicket. You told them they belonged, but you only valued them as long as they were productive for the brand." I saw the faces of the lonely, the elderly, and the poor who had slipped through the cracks of our growth-focused model. They were the invisible ones, the people who didn't look good in a promotional social media post. We hadn't ignored them by accident. We had ignored them by design because they didn't help the vision scale. My heart, or what was left of it in this state, felt like it was being compressed in a hydraulic press. The environment changed again, becoming uncomfortably, violently personal. I was suddenly at my own dinner table back in Columbus. My wife, Sarah, was there, picking at a salad. My 2 teenage kids were there, staring at their plates in a thick, suffocating silence. But I wasn't really there. Or rather, the real me wasn't. The man sitting at the head of the table was a hollow shell, his eyes fixed on his phone, frantically responding to a crisis text from a wealthy donor while his daughter tried to tell him about the bullying she faced at school that day. "The third mistake," Jesus said, standing at the head of the table, his presence casting a long shadow over the meal, "is the idolatry of the leader." He didn't have to explain it further. The visual was enough to break me. I saw the deep, jagged fracture in my own home. I had spent 20 years being a man of God to 10,000 strangers while being an utter stranger to my own flesh and blood. I had sacrificed my family on the altar of my own reputation, and I had called it the Lord's work. "You allowed the people to put you on a pedestal," Jesus said, "and you stayed there because you liked the view. You let them believe you were closer to me than they were. You became a mediator instead of a brother." I watched as my daughter's face fell, her shoulders slumping into a posture of defeat when I stood up from the table without a word to take a ministry call in the hallway. I saw the way Sarah looked at my empty chair, not with anger, but with a weary, finalized sort of grief. I was a ghost in my own house, chased by the ghost of my own ego. Then, the warning turned inward, and the air in the room grew heavy with a new, sharp kind of dread. Jesus leaned in, his face inches from mine, and for the first time, I felt the true heat of his holiness. "Because you chose the pedestal, David, you are about to lose the floor. Your institution is built on the myth of your perfection. But myths always shatter when they hit the ground." Suddenly, my phone on the table began to vibrate incessantly, a frantic, buzzing sound that wouldn't stop. A notification flashed on the screen. It was a leaked email. A private, arrogant vent I'd sent to an assistant about a difficult staff member, full of mockery and cold-hearted manipulation. It was the first crack in the dam. I saw Sarah's face go pale as she read the notification over my shoulder. I felt the first real sting of the personal future threat Jesus had alluded to. My reputation, the only currency I truly valued, was starting to liquefy. I wasn't just losing my life in an ambulance. I was losing the carefully constructed lie I had lived for 30 years. You thought the church was you, Jesus whispered. Now you will see what happens when you are all that's left. The dining room table didn't just fade. It seemed to corrode, the wood rotting away until we were standing in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of a local crisis center I had driven past 1,000 times but never actually entered. The air smelled of industrial floor cleaner and old grief. I saw a young woman sitting on a plastic chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with a silent, rhythmic tremor. She was a member of my church, someone I recognized from the front row of the Christmas Eve service. The fourth mistake, Jesus said, his voice now vibrating with a low, tectonic grief that felt like it was pulling at the very atoms of my being, is the sanitization of suffering. He walked over and placed a hand near the woman's shoulder. You taught them how to be blessed, David. You gave them 6 steps to a financial breakthrough and 10 verses for a promotion. But you never taught them how to bleed. I watched a memory flicker across the beige wall, like a projector gone haywire. It was this woman, 3 months ago, standing in my office. She was trying to tell me about the abuse she was enduring at home, about the crushing weight of a clinical depression. And there I was, the professional David, checking my Apple Watch under the desk. I saw myself hand her a generic, shrink-wrapped devotional booklet and tell her to just press into the joy of the Lord. I saw the way her eyes went dead, not with anger, but with a final, hollow acceptance, the moment I said it. You turned my gospel into a cosmetic, Jesus whispered, and the intensity of his gaze was almost physically painful. You wanted a gallery of polished stones, so you ignored the raw, jagged edges of the broken. When they cried out in pain, you told them they didn't have enough faith. You made my cross a piece of jewelry instead of a place where the dying come to find life. Because you were afraid of the mess, you left them to rot in the dark. I felt a physical ache in my phantom chest. I had traded the man of sorrows for a God of success. And in doing so, I had orphaned the very people I was called to protect. The scene shifted violently again, the crisis center walls stretching and darkening into a high-rise executive office in downtown Columbus. On the mahogany desk lay a series of thick, legal-bound folders, non-disclosure agreements, and severance packages. I recognized the names on the top sheets with a jolt of nausea. 3 staff members I had let go over the last 5 years, people who had poured their lives into the vision until they saw something they weren't supposed to see. The 5th mistake, Jesus said, his expression hardening into something terrifyingly righteous, is the weaponization of loyalty. He picked up one of the heavy pens on the desk, turning it over in his calloused fingers. You told them they were submitting to authority when they were actually just protecting your brand. You used my word to silence the whistleblowers. You called it sowing discord when they pointed out the rot in the foundation. I saw a vision of a closed-door meeting from late 2023. An associate pastor, a man who had been my friend for a decade, had questioned the lack of transparency in the multi-million-dollar building fund. I remembered the way I had looked at him, not with love, but with a calculated, predatory stillness. I remembered how I used a Sunday morning sermon on touching the Lord's anointed to subtly characterize him as a rebel to the entire congregation without ever saying his name. I watched him pack his cardboard box in the rain a week later, his reputation destroyed by the rumors I had quietly validated. You built a kingdom of fear and called it a culture of honor, Jesus said. He stepped toward me, and the office floor began to shake with a low, rumbling frequency. You were so worried about the vision that you sacrificed the visionaries. You traded the truth for an NDA and called it wisdom. But I am the truth, David, and you cannot sign a contract to keep me quiet. The floor beneath us started to crack, long, jagged fissures mirroring the structural failure of the life I had built. The institutional power I had spent decades accumulating felt like a lead weight tied to my ankles. The high-rise dissolved, and suddenly, I was back in the ambulance. But I wasn't hovering on the ceiling anymore. I was back in the body, feeling the brutal, rhythmic crushing of my ribs as the paramedic continued CPR with a desperate, tiring strength. The pain was blinding, a white-hot iron being driven into my marrow with every pump. But through the agony, I saw Jesus standing at the foot of the gurney. "The warning is no longer for the church, David," he said, his voice overlapping with the frantic calls of the medic to the hospital. "It is for you." He held out his hand, and a digital screen appeared in the air. It was my bank app. I saw the numbers fluctuating wildly. Then a notification flashed in bold red. "Account frozen, legal hold." I felt a jolt of pure, earthly terror. "What is this?" I tried to scream, but my lungs were full of fluid and the taste of copper. "The emails you sent to cover your tracks, the NDAs you forced on the innocent, the money you moved. It is all coming to light," Jesus said. "By the time your heart starts beating again, the life you knew will be gone." "Sarah is at the kitchen table right now, David. She just found the second phone you thought you'd hidden. The one with the messages to the woman in Cincinnati." The shame wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical weight that made it impossible to breathe. My moral compromise, the small allowances I'd made because I was stressed and doing so much for the kingdom, were being stripped bare. "You have a choice," Jesus said, his voice echoing over the scream of the ambulance siren. "You can go back and fight for your reputation. You can use your skills to spin the truth, to lie, and to keep the institution standing. Or you can let it die. You can let the pastor David the world knows perish on this gurney and finally meet the man I actually created." He leaned over me, his shadow falling across my broken chest. "But know this, if you go back, the truth will not be stopped. The ground is already moving. The only question is whether you will be crushed by the fall or cleansed by the ruins." The pain in my chest was no longer just a medical event. It was a soul-deep tearing. I looked up at Jesus, and for the first time, I didn't see a judge. I saw a doctor looking at a terminal tumor. The success of my ministry was the very growth that was killing my spirit. I looked at the digital screen still floating in the sterile, ozone-heavy air of the ambulance. The frozen bank accounts, the leaked emails, the shattered trust in my wife's eyes. My secret life wasn't a series of mistakes. It was the logical, rotting conclusion of a man who thought he could manage God like a brand. "If I go back," I rasped, the words tasting like copper and salt in a mouth that didn't feel like mine, "everyone will know. I'll lose the building. I'll be the cautionary tale people use to warn their children about the church." Jesus leaned closer. His breath didn't smell like the sweet incense of a cathedral. It smelled like rain on dry, thirsty earth. "You are already a cautionary tale, David. You just haven't had the courage to read the ending yet." He reached out and touched the jagged, broken edge of my sternum. The agony was exquisite, a searing heat that felt like it was cauterizing the lies. "The fifth mistake, the weaponization of loyalty, it ends with you. You can go back and try to fix the narrative. You can tell your congregation that this is a spiritual attack. Or you can go back and tell them the truth. You can be the first stone that falls so the rest of the temple can finally be rebuilt on something other than sand." I saw a flash of my son's face. He was 17, and he already looked at me with a quiet, simmering resentment I had always dismissed as teenage rebellion. I realized now it was his spirit sensing the dissonance of the lie I lived every Sunday. If I went back and lied again, I wouldn't just lose my church. I would lose his soul to the altar of my pride. The choice wasn't between life and death. It was between a comfortable, suffocating lie and a devastating, beautiful resurrection. I closed my eyes and whispered into the gray void, "Let it fall. Just let it all fall." The transition back wasn't a gentle slide or a peaceful waking. It was a high-speed car crash. Slam. The world rushed in with a deafening, industrial roar of mechanical beeps and the sharp, stinging smell of iodine. My lungs screamed as they expanded for the first time in 24 minutes, hitting the air like it was shards of glass. I felt the cold, hard plastic of the intubation tube shoving down my throat, triggering a violent, rhythmic gag reflex. My eyes snapped open, but everything was a frantic blur of harsh white lights and blue surgical scrubs. "We have a pulse." Sinus rhythm restored. "He's fighting the vent." I tried to move my hand, to reach for the memory of the man I had just seen, to hold on to the clarity of that hallway, but my arms were restrained. I was strapped to the gurney. The physical reality of the Ohio morning hit me like a physical blow. The paramedic, the young woman who had been so clinical and aggressive, was leaning over me, her face now streaked with sweat and a sudden, fierce relief that looked like tears. "Stay with us, David. You're back. You're at Riverside Methodist. Just breathe through the tube. Don't fight it." But I wasn't just breathing air. I was breathing the weight of the wreckage waiting for me outside those ambulance doors. As they wheeled me through the double doors of the ER, the wheels of the gurney clicking rhythmically on the linoleum, I saw a familiar face in the waiting room. It was my executive pastor, Mark. He wasn't praying. He was huddled in a corner on his phone, his face tight with a frantic, professional panic. He saw me, and for a split second, our eyes locked through the glass. I didn't see brotherly love or relief in his gaze. I saw damage control. He was already calculating the press release. He was already thinking about how to spin the mistakes. I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the hospital AC. The personal future threat wasn't coming. It was already standing in the room, waiting to see if I would stay quiet. 3 days later, I was sitting in a cardiac recovery bed, the hum of the monitors a constant, mocking reminder of my fragility. The doctors called it a widowmaker heart attack. They said it was a miracle I had no brain damage after being down for so long. They used words like resilience and modern medical intervention. I sat there in silence, knowing that the miracle wasn't that my heart started beating again. It was that it had finally broken. Sarah came in around 4 p.m. on Friday. She didn't bring flowers this time. She didn't sit on the edge of the bed and hold my hand. She sat in the stiff vinyl chair by the window, her winter coat still on, her eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by a grief that was older than this heart attack. She looked at me, and I saw the relationship break Jesus had warned me about. It wasn't a screaming match. It was a silent, vast canyon that had finally opened up between our chairs. "The elders called," she said, her voice flat and drained of all color. "They found the ledger, David. The one for the discretionary missions fund. The one you said was for the orphanage in Guatemala. It wasn't there." She paused, her lip trembling just once. "And Mark turned over his phone to the board this morning. He gave them the emails you sent him about the NDAs. He's trying to save himself, David." I felt the floor of my world finish its slow, agonizing collapse. This was the irreversible, grounded event. In the past, I would have had a sophisticated explanation. I would have had a vision or a carefully plucked scripture to deflect the blame onto spiritual warfare. But as I looked at her, I felt the phantom weight of Jesus's calloused hand on my broken ribs. I remembered the 5 mistakes. I remembered this sanitization of suffering I had practiced on my own wife. I reached out my hand, the one that wasn't hooked to a pulsing fork, and left it open and palm up on the white hospital sheets. It was an invitation, not a command. "It's all true, Sarah," I whispered, the words finally coming out without the polish of a sermon. "Everything they found, every bit of it is true. I've been building a tomb." The silence in the room was suffocating. She didn't move toward me. She didn't take my hand. She just stared out the window at the gray Columbus skyline, where a light dusting of October snow was beginning to fall against the glass. My phone, sitting on the bedside table, lit up with a notification from the church's private leadership app. "Urgent, special business meeting tonight. All staff and elders required." I looked at the small, red 1 on the screen. It looked like a drop of blood. I was alive, but the Pastor David, who had walked into that closet mirror, was dead. I lay there in the sterile quiet, listening to the rhythmic thump hiss of the oxygen machine, waiting for the rest of the walls to come down. The snow continued to fall, silent and indifferent, covering the city in a thin, cold veil of white.